Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode, what is it now, 4 of the ACW debrief series, the IKS Grand ACW game, which ended perhaps prematurely, but I think everybody involved is kind of grateful to have it over in a way. um, so today we're going to be talking about the land war in the West, as well as the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Arlington and Roth's attempt to capture DC, um, leading up to one of our more storied encounters in the Delaware naval invasion, which will probably be the subject of next episode. So we have General James, one of the principal commanders in the Western Theater, with us. And we thought that before we went through the chronology of the Western Theater in this kind of 2 month span from May through June of 1861, we would just get his thoughts on the campaign and what it was like fighting out there. So I'm also joined by Tack today, our regular guest and host of the last episode. So, Tack, if you had any questions that you wanted to ask James, or we could just open up the floor to him to get his thoughts, whichever you think is best.
I would like to start with his thoughts. I'm sure we'll have questions.
Yeah, so James, if you'd want to just give us your thoughts, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I was the commander of the Army of the West, which started off as a rather small army in Memphis and then slowly grew over time to include three or four different armies that I was over. Fighting in the West was interesting. I think it felt as it did historically, where the East kept getting all the attention and the West was forgotten often. I, it was an interesting scenario for me, starting off at Memphis. Everything centered around the Mississippi River. You really couldn't get too far from that, and it was such a big barrier in terms of movement and logistics, which was probably good for me because my primary objective was just to defend. And so I had a nice big long Mississippi to my west, and then the Kentucky border to my north, if I can find that. Here it is. Um, which for a while the Union, and I know I definitely didn't want to cross it and anger the Kentuckians. So even though I had giant swaths of territory to defend theoretically compared to the East, it actually was pretty concentrated because everything had to revolve kind of around this narrow avenue of the Mississippi and Memphis. The Union had to take Memphis or get around it and flank it before they could take the South. And I was hoping that they would make the mistake of trying to get deep into Arkansas and leave Memphis alone, and then I'd come in behind them and just cut off their supply lines. But they're smarter than that, so that didn't work out. But in terms of So I was primarily defensive, but I didn't like the idea of just sitting there. I wanted an aggressive defense, and so pretty early on, I moved up, crossed over to the west side of the Mississippi, and then we moved up to. I'm looking for it now. Ohio City. So we came up here, and we actually, I think, the first small engagement was fortunate in that we caught some Union by surprise. I think captured a few bits of soldiers. And then I knew they were more crossing to the north, and so I had an idea of moving around here to Commerce and then trapping them over here. What I hadn't accounted for was just the sheer amount of time it takes to move, men and materials across the Mississippi, which I should have, but I just wasn't thinking about it. And so I'm in my first major battle. I'm in the process of um, getting over to the Illinois side of the Mississippi, and with half my army across and the other half not across, and then that's when the Union came from the north. And that was my first major blunder. I knew that they were operating around Jefferson City and St. Louis, and for some reason I thought they'd stay there. I just wasn't thinking that they'd come south towards me, which I should have. And so they arrived at Commerce, and we had a big battle there. Luckily, I held, and then we had a big foot race where I ran. if I can find it now.
Ran
Let's
up
see.
to Cape Girardeau first, and then
Yeah, from there, then west. I'm trying to find Ironton.
up here to Ironton.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, so we had a big foot race up here. We had um, an attempted ambush east of
Right around
Ironton,
here.
which, yeah, right there, that didn't work out. But I had a lot of fun just trying to find a good ambush spot. And then that didn't work, so then we just basically retreated south and went back to Memphis.
Yeah,
At
down to
that point,
Osceola eventually, I think.
oh yeah, well Osceola stayed there for a little while and then eventually left that for Memphis. Um, I had the idea to send because I really didn't like the idea of the Union owning Missouri so quickly, and so I had an idea to send Boone and his men towards Jefferson City, um, and kind of hoping for a grassroots movement to rally the Missourians and retake Missouri. And I was hoping the Union would uh, be focused on me and just miss them and they could retake Jefferson City, then maybe St. Louis. Unfortunately, the logistics on him were not as forgiving as I'd hoped, and he and his men ran out of food and weren't as supported by the locals as I hoped, and so he returned um, not in great condition. It was a failure, and that wasn't good. Uh, in the meantime, I'm basically in Memphis at this point, just training my men and waiting. The Union, this a little bit of time later, the Union made the brilliant move, and this is from my point of view. I still don't know exactly what theirs was, but they crossed from New Madrid over to Obianville and then set up a pretty strong defense here with a little toehold on Tennessee. And that concerned me. So we started, bringing some of the Eastern forces from East Tennessee and elsewhere to start to build defenses here. But I also saw it as an opportunity because I knew they had some forces in Osceola and now some were on the east side of the Mississippi. And so I thought in the middle of winter to cross and attack and take Osceola. Um, with either the goal of capturing the Union forces that were in there, or at the very least, just distracting the Union forces at Obianville and buying time for my forces here to come towards them. Basically, catch them while they're vulnerable on both sides of the river. So we did that. We got to Osceola. We surrounded them, but I didn't want. I could have attacked then, and I didn't want to because I wanted to preserve my men. And so I think we sieged for, I don't know, a week or 2 or 3.
2 weeks, I think.
Yeah, so, which I probably should have attacked because it left enough time for the Union to come down, and then there's a big battle. And I feel like it was very close, but in the end, I wasn't able to take Osceola and had to retreat south and back into Memphis. So, um, kind of an opportunity lost there not to attack earlier, be a bit more bold in that attack. But in some ways, I think it did its job in that it drew a lot of attention, and drew forces back to the west side. And right as the game was being called, I had 2 large armies moving up to Troy. I had my army in Memphis on its way to join them, and we were about to have a major offensive thrust, try to retake Obianville and hopefully trap that army that was there before they could cross, and then moving on from there. But that's basically where we ended it. So overall, I had a blast playing in the West. It was really fun. It's an area, even the historians and wargamers, we like to focus on the East too. It's more known, it's more exciting maybe. But it was fun to play in the West and to think about it. I had to think about. I didn't have too many river boats, but I had a few and how to use them in conjunction with my army. Taking advantage of that, I had to make sure that we put forts along the river, so that my biggest fear was the Union Navy defeating us and cutting us off from being able to cross the Mississippi at all. But so at least when we stopped, we had a pretty good stronghold with the forts and the Navy, the Brown River Navy that I had. And it was just a lot of fun to think big operational scale what to do, and as well as have a few sub commanders under me that I was giving orders to. So I appreciate Carter and everyone who ran the game and did it for so long. I know it was a lot of effort on your part.
Well, as the Navy umpire, since you mentioned riverboats, uh, based on the timing, something that you wouldn't know, you were about to get a couple of ironclad gunboats before too long,
Hmm.
but the Union Navy was actually getting ready to start getting, honestly, serial production of ironclad gunboats. At least enough in numbers that they were going to become a serious problem to your abilities to contest the river. So what would have changed with your plans? Because that would have been about 3 to 4 weeks after the game ended is when they would have started getting their swarm.
Well, so my main concerns were I knew the historic forts. I'm looking for them here. Donaldson and Henry up here somewhere. Where are they at?
Fort Henry's not
Anyway,
going to be isn't marked on the map,
oh
but
yeah. But anyway, up there, I knew those forts were important. So
actually, no, they are. They're Fort Henry's here and Fort
oh, here
Donelson.
there. There you go. That was a little bit north. Um, so I knew those were important. I didn't want to lose those. Of course, it's a can race. My main thinking was we had the forts over here, Fort Pillow, Fort Chickasaw, these. And my goal was if there was going to be a Navy battle, it would be in the shadow of the forts and the guns there so that I'd have as much advantage as possible. And so I would have, if they came south, I would have fought a big fight here uh, using the forts as support and pray that I could have survived and held and basically kept them from getting all the way to Memphis. I don't know how that would have turned out, but that's what my plan was.
And you also had Fort Harris as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
lots of forts. Yeah. Well, is there anything else? I can't quite think of anything unless if you wanted to ask him a question, Tack, about anything specifically kind of in that early section of the campaign, since that's what we'll be focusing on today. Um,
Okay. Speaking to that, you had fought a portion of the Union Army at Ohio City.
Hmm.
Um, and then you knew that the Union had an army at Cairo. What was your ultimate plan for your Illinois raid? I know it got wound up getting cut a bit short, but what was your ultimate plan for your Illinois raid?
Um, I wasn't thinking too strongly about my own logistics, which I should have more. And I think that's true across the whole game initially, that it wasn't, even from an umpire perspective, it wasn't as strong as it ended up later on in the game. But uh, my my main goal was to get in, come over on the top of them, cut them off from the rail line here, and then basically trap whatever that army was, trap it down there and capture them. And then from that point, my goal, if I had been successful in that, I was planning to march all the way to Jefferson City and then St. Louis. My early initial objective was to retake Missouri, and so had I not lost at Commerce, um, I would have been moving towards that goal.
Okay. Um, and just kind of for our viewers to explain, the at the time when these battles happen, there are no armed gunboats on the river to speak of.
Right.
Nobody has real armed gunboats. In theory, any boat can be a gunboat if you put a gun on it, but nobody had any converted. We've got heavy guns on this thing gunboats.
hmm
Yep.
Although somebody did think that somebody had gunboats, and that will play in. That's a surprise tool that will help us later.
Yeah.
I will say James, that part of the reason you were able to get out of Cape Girardeau is that at that point, due to circumstances that we'll cover, the Union commander believed that you had gunboats
Well, that's good.
and did not, and that I think that was a factor in his planning for how he was going to wiggle you out of Cape Girardeau after you got out of Commerce.
Hmm. Interesting.
All right,
Yeah.
Carter, you want to get to the initial maneuvers and into the Battle of Commerce?
Yeah, sure.
Because that is definitely our first major fight in the West.
Yeah.
I'm going to drop off. Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
Thank you,
James.
Bye.
All right, so we are currently sitting on the May 21st, 1861 reporting state. You can tell kind of generally where we are because the Battle of Bull Run is about to happen. So this is happening concurrently with that at the moment. Um, so, uh, as of May 21st, the Union force concentrations are in St. Louis and Cairo. And the Union force in St. Louis under Diego Archuleta has marched west out of St. Louis towards Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri, which had been captured by Confederate sympathizers. So he's going to liberate that. The Missouri State Guard was standing in his way, but was only about 1/3 of the strength, and so decided to, instead of engaging him, retreat south towards a place called Cape Girardeau, or however the Missourians pronounce it. And so uh, Archuleta is going to take Jefferson City without a fight and reinstall the pro-Union Missouri state government into that capital. Meanwhile, Harding, with his Army of the Mississippi, is forming up in Cairo, getting ready for operations down that river towards Memphis. And so you can see then the two main Confederate force concentrations in the Missouri State Guard heading towards Cape Girardeau and the Army of Tennessee in Memphis. And if we want to move forward a week, we can see how that changes things. Tack, I think you have the say for that.
I do. Stand by. Here's hoping that this save happened before my TTS issues kicked in.
Mm. If need be, we can skip kind of straight to June, but I don't think that'll be a problem.
I did lose. I lost two or three sets of saves due to TTS issues.
Yeah,
But I think this is it. Yep.
The next week, not much has changed. Missouri State Guard has captured, or well, not really captured, but has reached Cape Girardeau, and the Army of the Mississippi has split itself into two halves. One half in Cairo, basically a brigade, 2,000 men, and then the other brigade, Second Brigade, in Ohio City, on the other side of the river, kind of guarding both sides of the entrance to that part of the Mississippi. And this is the half of the army that James was talking about attacking earlier. That'll happen later. And as you can see, Jefferson City is captured. So this is May 29th, correct? Or 28th, whatever this is?
Yes. Yep. 28th, 29th, right in there.
This is the same turn that the day after this report is going to be the Battle of Bull Run. So I think I've got the save after this. So let's see if I can pull that one open. Yeah, okay. So here's June 4th, the next save. We're just going to run through this 1 week at a time here. Not much is going to change, so we'll get through this pretty quick. Or kind of chronology here. So, that week, the next week, General Boone sent one of his infantry regiments over the river to kind of watch the army of the Mississippi in Cairo. And at this moment is when basically Harding starts just like freaking out. He's just gonna he's gonna get super paranoid about Confederate movements, and as you can see, he's already dug in and all that. So what the Confederates actually did a really good job of, even with their inferior forces, is just like catching the Union off guard and making them paranoid about coming under attack. And so, essentially, and to be fair, these armies are about the same size. They're not even really armies, they're glorified divisions at this point in the war. But the Missouri State Guard has paralyzed or just immobilized the Army of the Mississippi by placing itself in Cape Girardeau and putting a picket essentially on guard there. And as you can see, James with the Army of the Tennessee has moved up to Obionville, and so you can already see this kind of like opportunity forming that the Confederates have clearly noticed that they can potentially take out one of the Union forces here and then deal with the other in detail. And as you can see, Archuleta is marching back from Jefferson City to St. Louis after having successfully reinstalled the pro-Union government there. So let's move on then to the next turn, which will be, what is that, June 11th? Too far. There it is, June 11th. Come on now. This will be the most frustrating part of all of these debriefs, is switching between save states. So June 11th. James has captured Ohio City, destroying that brigade for the most part. Harding has been reinforced with the Missouri State Guard retreating their pickets back out to Cape Girardeau. And so this is the turn now that both these armies are going to attempt to cross the river and take out Harding. What they don't know, because they couldn't know, is that Archuleta is marching down, instead of going to St. Louis, he's marching down towards Cape Girardeau because he received the reports of the Missouri State Guard being there. So now that he knows where it is, he's going to go out and try and kill it. And unintentionally, him trying to take out the Missouri State Guard is going to lead him right to James. And at the same time, the Army of the Mississippi has seen this army take Ohio City, and they're going to attempt, as soon as James leaves, a amphibious assault on Ohio City, which would have gone disastrously had they tried it. But James was gone, and so all of a sudden, the Army of the Mississippi is going to be on the other side of the river behind James, who is marching towards Commerce. And the Army of the West is going to find itself in Cape Girardeau, behind the Missouri State Guard, which is also marching to Commerce. And they're going to find themselves meeting in Benton and then marching towards Commerce, both about to attack the rear of the combined Missouri State Guard, Army of Tennessee. And that's kind of the setup for the Battle of Commerce. So if we move now to the next turn, let's see, there's June 11th. Here's June 16th. So this is probably an interim save. It's only 5 days instead of 7. So yeah, there it is. You can see, so Harding has crossed the river, and actually a detachment of cavalry captured Cairo behind him, which is his first indication that the Confederates were crossing the river. Meanwhile, Archuleta is closing in on the rear of the army, and you can see that about half of all the Confederate troops are on this side of the river, and the other half are here. And it's this turn, June 16th, where James and Boone get the notice that Archuleta is coming on them from behind. And this is when James has to make a decision. Does he cross the river with the rest of his forces and risk getting cut off and all the shenanigans that has to do with? Potentially getting part of his force annihilated on this side of the river? Or does he try to cross this half back before Archuleta can get there so that he can potentially stand and fight in Commerce? And he decides to abandon the Missouri expedition and get all of his forces back across the river to Commerce and fight there. Meanwhile, Harding and Archuleta are going to meet and attack him. So that's June 16th. Let's find here. June 23rd.
I'm not sure if there'll be. I'm not sure if there'll be a save state or if it'll be the Battle of Commerce before it, but we'll find out.
Let's go ahead and look at the Battle of Commerce then. So, because we already know what the operational movement's going to look like, we don't need to show them every single one. But we actually did find a map of Commerce that I had to do some Photoshop work to kind of imagine what the terrain looked like on the west side of the river, but besides just the riverbank. But it was mostly just woods, so that was fine. So we have the Confederates deployed in a defensive line around Commerce, and the Union deployed in siege lines, in fact, preparing for an assault against the city itself. So um, the Union are just going to throw their heads into the wall here and see what's going to happen. And generally,
So
yeah, if you want to
I was
explain.
I was about to. So to set this stage, remember what I said before when James was talking. At this time, neither side had gunboats. Neither side had the ability to effectively close the river to the other. So in theory, and emphasis on the theory, the Confederates could withdraw, could send word, get riverboats, and try to withdraw by river south. So that is something that's kind of weighing on the combined army, the Union Army's mind. Because when you look at this, you go, their backs to the river. There's nothing they can do except try to break the siege. And ultimately, what happens in this battle, you're going to question why. That, in the Union's defense, the possibility of the Confederates performing some sort of retrograde with at least part of their force does exist, which
Yeah.
is really pressing on them. That being said, the Union forces were hyper aggressive in this particular phase. Another thing that will be noted is, and I think it's over here, right here. At this time, remember the storming of Gosport. Because of the storming of Gosport, the Confederates at this time of the war had so much heavy artillery, they didn't know what to do with it. They had so many 24 pounders, 32 pounders. They had no idea what to do with these kind of outdated, but still bigger than normal guns. And so the decision from the president and everybody else was, let's send them to the field armies. Ultimately, most of them wind up getting moved into fortifications that we'll talk about later. But they had so many, they sent batteries to the field armies. These two batteries, in fact, this one in particular, will play into some things. As I mentioned before, the Union believed that the Confederates had gunboats. The fact that the Confederates were deploying heavy artillery in the field because they had it and they needed guns uh, is why the Union believed that they had gunboats. Because why else would they have big guns in this army?
Yeah.
But so you have those two factors kind of playing into things in this battle. Carter, you want to go into the Union attack plan?
Yeah. I will say that we didn't like feed the Union like, oh, you think you might see a gunboat or anything. That was just something that like they heard heavy guns and they thought, well, shoot, like who in their right mind would ever have heavy artillery in a field army? With
Especially one this small.
right. So yeah, that wasn't like us trying to like confuse them on purpose. That was just an assertion that they made. Yeah. So the attack plan. I mean, it was it was really pretty simple. You can see they're drawn up like this in just a circle around the city, and they're attacking straight towards the enemy. The infantry is kind of in the spots where the woods provide the most cover for the approach, and the artillery is deployed basically along the two roads leading into Commerce, where the only clear lines of sight for these two batteries and these two batteries lie. Um, so, like, the nature of the terrain really limits any role the artillery can play, except for, in the case of the Confederates, point uh, pushing a bunch of canister into the front of the Union lines as they emerge from the woods at point blank range. So, um, that's generally the plan. What's going to end up happening if I load up the end state here because I've got that. Let's see if I can find it. There it is. Is the Union attacks are going to, in the south, succeed, and in the north, be repulsed. And what's going to end up happening is that the Confederates are going to end up holding off the attack in the south long enough to then launch a counterattack in the north and break through the Union attacking lines, which have pretty much by that point broken, which opens then up the river road up towards Cape Girardeau as a potential avenue of escape, which James and Boone then elect to take. And that's the ultimate result of the Battle of Commerce.
Yeah, I do have to give. I'm going to give him grief later. The Battle of Osceola, I'm going to give him a lot of grief for. But I will give James a lot of credit in this battle. Boone was running the northern part of the operation, and James was running the southern part. And in the particular assault, it was the Army of the Mississippi under Harding in the north, and I think it was Archuleta's forces in the south.
Yeah.
So that's your matchup. The Union had, as you saw in the last save, if you were to count it up, the Union had a 3-2 advantage. So not enough to do a successful assault by the numbers, but more than enough with somebody pinned to the wall to be able to pin them down and beat them to death eventually, even if it was bloody. To give credit where it's due to Archuleta, as you note here, he had superior artillery. That was really where he had a superior arm, and he was trying to get it into play. He just never got it. The battle was over before he was able to finally get his artillery around into position. And James did an excellent job. Actually, James and Boone did an excellent job of coordinating together and throwing their reserves back and forth. This battle for the umpires, the Confederate lines in this battle were an absolute disaster because it kept going. Well, this brigade now works for this guy. Nope, it works for this guy. Nope, it works for this guy. They were just being whipsawed back and forth across the field, defending every single spot.
It was almost like a siege in a total war game where, units from the defender kept retreating back to the town square and reforming. And then whichever general was closest and needed the men would come and say, "You, come with me. You're coming to my part of the line because I need somebody to plug a hole."
Very much that. And as you'll notice, the Confederates had a number of casualties in the commanders that were not the two primary commanders. As far as
high.
Yep. Now, obviously, we're at the end state, and a lot of things have been moved so that we can do all the math that comes with a campaign-style game. So, for people that are asking, how did the Union get into this position where the Confederates were able to make a counterattack? I want you to note, at the beginning of this battle, if you remember the first end state, these breastworks to about here exist. That was part of the Confederate camp prior to the battle. These breastworks in the north did not exist at the beginning of this battle. So I'm giving credit where it's due. I'm going to throw some darts. The Union plan would have worked had both forces coordinated a continuous assault. If they coordinated what you would call an in echelon assault, whereas as your assaulting force peters out, you throw another one in, they could have pretty likely overwhelmed Boone and James. What ended up happening in this fight is that Archuleta went flat out into assaulting these works. He carries these works to the second line where he actually takes one out, but you can still see this one surviving heavy battery. These batteries swept whole regiments off the field. James had his heavy batteries in his second line. With nobody had good troops, but he had fresh troops with them, and they were able to sweep the field. And essentially, James was able to retake his original works after the first attack. While this is going on, this first attack is going on, Harding's Army of the Mississippi is still forming up and preparing for their assault, which buys Boone the hour he needed to dig in. And he was able to throw up some crude breastworks, which provided a bit of a bonus to his troops and obviously a morale boost.
The +1 on the die roll, yeah.
Yeah, just before Harding came down on him. So Harding comes in, and by the time Harding comes in, Boone has just managed to establish that you shall not pass line and get his guys ready to take him on and rotate his fresh reserves that weren't digging the breastworks into the line. So essentially, Archuleta almost succeeds, but just enough reserves are able to be thrown in to throw him back. Then Harding comes down, is rebuffed. Archuleta comes in a second time, and ultimately Archuleta was coming in a third time with the backing of this massive grand battery of that's
6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36, 42, 48.
Yeah, that's 48 guns. He was coming in with a grand battery that effectively exceeded the entire Confederate artillery park at the start of the battle to blast the Confederates off of Commerce itself. And that was ultimately when I think it was actually about the time they saw the head of this column coming in, and Archuleta had enough infantry up there they couldn't counterattack at this column of artillery, is when Boone and James made the decision, hey, I think there's a weak spot in the Army of the Mississippi, and there was. And they took advantage of it and just plowed into it, and essentially a hell for leather all-out assault.
If I'm not mistaken, I think what it was what Harding's initial assault repulsed most of the Missouri State Guard off the line, and in their place went the existing reserve, which was the Florida Division of James's army. And then when they noticed the weak point in Harding, that's when the Missouri State Guard had recovered. And so then the Florida Division kind of parted like the Red Sea so that the Missouri State Guard could punch through between them and then hit Harding. And that opened up the road to Cape Girardeau. So, yeah, good coordination on the Confederate side there.
Definitely.
And to be fair to the Union, the terrain on their side of the battlefield did not lend itself well to cooperation or attacking on echelon. It was pretty shitty terrain. Probably would have benefited from a couple weeks of preparing the terrain, cutting down trees, clearing out fields of fire, whatever, but they didn't have that time. So, in the event,
and like I noted, that is something to stress. In true 2020 hindsight, could the Union have just sieged James and Boone down here? Technically, yes, they could have. Neither side had gunboats, so neither side had the ability to truly cut the river. By the same token, had James and Boone started trying to retrograde while surrounded, they would have invited an assault that would have just overwhelmed whatever was left. Yeah. So there was that potential to get them comfortable in a lane in a siege line, or force them to assault out to try to get away, knowing that if they don't, they'll lose at least half their army as they try to escape. Ultimately, the Confederates take some pretty nasty casualties on this battle.
They do.
However, especially they lose their artillery park. That is the biggest takeaway, is they lose the bulk of their artillery.
Yeah, like almost all of it.
Yeah, I think when this battle's over, I think they had the one heavy battery, and then honestly, that is, well,
they had a couple. They had a few light batteries.
Yeah, they had these that weren't taken out yet. So yeah, ultimately, I think they were able to patch together about 3 batteries of artillery.
Yeah.
out of their army. So that is the Battle of Commerce, and because the Union coordination wasn't there, which is not a dig against the players, because this game taught me one thing as an umpire, and as somebody who's been a student of the Civil War for 20 years, that given a set of players, and I've said this before, and I'm going to continue to say this throughout the series, given a set of players who have the knowledge of, some of them are also Civil War grognards and have studied it intensely, and who are fully capable of simply hopping on Wikipedia, the world's worst resource site, and seeing what mistakes were made in this war. They still made a lot of the same mistakes, and that's telling, and that explains that these guys that made these mistakes in the war weren't stupid. These mistakes were made because what we consider mistakes in hindsight were made because of circumstances. And they made the same decision. In a lot of cases, they made the same decisions. So while we dig at the Union a little bit here for missing a golden opportunity to annihilate the entire Confederate force in the West in a day, it's not that the Union are bumbling around. It's simply they're learning to communicate on this scale, because this scale is, while this battle is not huge, the scale of this campaign, the scale of the consequences of your decisions, means that this battle is far more important than your average open Saturday, even if you had 3 or 4 corps fighting in an open Saturday battle, because this has carry on consequences, and players get very cagey about wholesale sacrificing troops.
Yep. For sure.
So this battle ends, and the Confederates take off at a dead run that away.
Up towards Cape Girardeau. Yep.
Yep.
Let's head back to the ops map and see where they ended up going. If I can find it here.
And keep in mind, because of the heavy guns, that even though they overran some of them did make an escape. The Union now believes that the Confederates have gunboats on the river. And if I am not mistaken, Archuleta sends part of his force back to St. Louis to support the one brigade he had left in St. Louis. I think he sends a second brigade back to St. Louis and weakens his pursuit force in order to make sure that St. Louis doesn't get hammered from behind by this ghost gunboat division that he really does believe exists, because he received reports about heavy cannon ripping regiments to pieces right by the river. I gave those reports, and I think that's pretty close to verbatim. He doesn't receive a report that there are gunboats, but he receives a report of heavy cannon ripping regiments to pieces right by the river, and he takes the extremely short logical leap that the Confederates have at least one gunboat on the river, which changes his dynamic quite a bit in the pursuit.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
So
yep.
We can see War Department reinforcements arrive in Ohio City for Archuleta here at the end of the turn, which almost would double his army if you look at it. And then James and Boone are up here in Cape Girardeau. So let's take a look.
Their cavalry detachment
on a run around.
The cavalry detachment. I think that was the one that was the cavalry that weren't able to cross over at Commerce because of the battle, and they wind up taking a loop around somewhere. I can't remember exactly how.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and go from June 23rd then to.
That's right. The cavalry. Real quick. The cavalry Oh man, that's way oversized. The cavalry, right as you're doing that, they couldn't cross at Commerce, so they cross at Cape Girardeau, and they're headed south because at that point they thought the army was trapped at Commerce.
Yeah.
So the cavalry are operating under basically umpire control as a colonel trying to save his force.
Yep. All right, so
All right.
there's June 23rd. Here's June 30th. And so at this point, we are a couple weeks after Manassas and Arlington now, if we're trying to kind of like um, pace it in our minds, put it together. Um, this is the save right before shut-in gap, as James and the Union are running towards Ironton, away from Cape Girardeau, with pretty much the entire Union force on his back. It doesn't look like he detached a brigade up towards St. Louis. Maybe he does that after shut-in gap. I don't know. But
Maybe.
yeah.
So one thing to note here is that in some part, due to the Union trying to figure out where to put their cavalry, and they had heavily focused their cavalry on their eastern forces at this point after Manassas. Archuleta has only got 2 regiments of cavalry to James's 6. So Archuleta is unable to force James to stop and give battle, and he's also unable to harass his rear guard effectively. Which is why you have these 2 armies playing chasey, kissy, kissy all the way around Missouri.
Yeah, because James at this point doesn't have the forces to fight him in a fair fight.
Nope.
But Archuleta doesn't have the forces to make that happen, regardless of what James wants.
Yeah, I mean, Archuleta's got a 1.5 to 1 advantage in infantry and about a 1.5 to 1 advantage in artillery. He's 3 to 1 disadvantage in cavalry, which means he can't force James to fight if James doesn't want to.
Yeah. So at this point, I don't know, Attack, if you have a save.
I'm going to look. I may have a save for the Battle of Ironton.
This was one of the more unique battles that we ever did in the game because there is no map of shut-in gap. And so what we ended up doing was James identified a spot on the topographic map mode of Google Maps that he wanted to ambush him along the historic road, which is now, a paved road nowadays. And so we used Google Maps, but like the topographic mode for the battle map, and it was interesting. it was pretty jank, but it worked, and that's what mattered.
I do not. I do not have a. I'm looking through all my saves. I think this was when I was starting to have save state issues.
Okay. It might be under shut-in gap if you're using a code or if you're using a keyword search, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't have it.
Yeah. But essentially, it's an ambush battle where James set up on either side of a mountain pass. Not exactly a mountain pass, kind of big hills.
A hill pass.
Yeah, and attempted to smash down on the Union from both sides. And
the best way to look at it is if you want to pull up a historical battle that matches this, the Battle of Lake Trasimene is what James attempted to do.
Yeah. But it didn't work out that way. The Union were able to effectively repulse his assault with heavy loss.
Yeah, and this is where I have to give credit to Archuleta. The instant he saw the map, he said, "Oh, they're trying to do Lake Trasimene to me. I'm going to do this."
Yep.
So he immediately identified the danger. We are going to give players crap throughout the game, throughout these after actions, but we're also going to praise them where they did right. And Archuleta immediately spotted what James was trying to do and moved to counter it. he wasn't able to reverse it on James, but he was able to keep from being ambushed effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, um what the he didn't turn the tables, but he totally just neutered James's plan of trying to crush him with treachery. So it didn't work out that way. And so
And
James,
ultimately, James takes the option of bugging out.
yeah, and he's going to retreat back into um, Arkansas, which we'll go up one more turn just to kind of show that he's going that way, and then I think we can kind of leave it at that
Well,
for the West.
yeah. Well, before we go to the other turn, if we want to shift to the east, just
Sure.
to show where things have changed, because this is the point where things have shifted in the
Yes.
east.
So Roth has taken Arlington, but can't take DC, and the bridges are blown. Um, so he's left 6 infantry and 3 batteries of artillery to just watch over the heights, make sure that the Union doesn't try something stupid. Um, and uh, then it's up to Roth then to send the main portion of his army, 3 corps, I believe in total. Yeah, about 50. Well, we're looking at probably 40,000 men, going on 50,000 men on each side here, and he's going to try and cross the river at White's Ferry or White's Ford, which is where, fun fact, Lee crossed into Maryland during the invasion of Maryland in 1862, and try to come around D.C. the backside. But Eggert is able to get into position to kind of block that before he's able to expand his bridgehead out into Maryland. Um, and so
Yep.
Eggert is
So-
eventually going to be able to just bottle him up in this bend in the Potomac River here and prevent that from happening.
Well, and that's also, at this point, that's also Roth's kind of secondary plan. If you look at where Roth is, if you look at the terrain under him,
Yeah.
he gets onto these hills right here at Poolesville, and Eggert's already on them. And as you can see, they've been here about a week at this point because they're dug in. But Roth gets across here. Harper's Ferry has been retaken and garrisoned. He gets across here, and this is where Roth kind of shifts away from I'm going to. His first attempt is yes, I'm going to try to get onto DC the backside. But as soon as he spots Eggert coming at him, he stays on the hills and starts digging in under the assumption that I can force Eggert because it's hidden, but he's got his entire army minus 6 infantry regiments right here. And he's figuring I'm on these hills right here at Poolesville, I'll dig in and effectively create a Gettysburg sort of scenario at not that far off from Sharpsburg. Sharpsburg's right here.
Yeah, he's trying to do an Antietam.
Yeah, he's trying to force Eggert to do an Antietam on worse terrain for Eggert, effectively, where he is unflankable because his cavalry only have to cover a very narrow frontage. So
and
his
flank is anchored on the Monocacy River there. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's got one flank anchored, the other flank's anchored on the Potomac. It is insurmountable, at least in short order. And yeah, Roth is sitting here hoping at this point. Roth is hoping Eggert's going to attack him, and Eggert spots it and says nope, and just digs in, hoping Roth is going to come off his hill and attack him.
And Eggert
they spend 2 weeks just staring at each other.
And Eggert is operating under explicit orders from Sec Ward: do not attack Roth in anything other than extremely favorable positions for you, right? And so Eggert is at this point under extremely close watch from the Secretary of War, both in geographic proximity, and Secretary of War just does not want to lose another army in the field, and is wary after what he thought was a disappointing performance at Arlington, which of course we saw a couple episodes ago. Roth was praising Eggert, his performance at Arlington, said that people sleep on that battle, in his words. But in the Union frame of mind at this point, Eggert is on thin ice, and so he's trying not. Basically, at
Yep.
this point, he's trying not to lose his job, and so he's being very cautious.
Well, and to kind of show something, this is also an issue that Roth is dealing with. Roth is quite a ways from Richmond. He's at kind of the top of his supply line. And if you add up Roth's army, he's running about 26. He's running about 46 infantry, about 24 artillery, and 10 cavalry. Eggert, if you remember, Eggert's army was almost functionally destroyed. The Army of the Potomac has been functionally destroyed twice in the last month, and he is 47 infantry, 24 artillery, and 7 cavalry. He's almost equal with Roth.
And the Union is sitting on a lot of cavalry and infantry in Washington, 36 cavalry that Secretary of War doesn't know what to do with.
Yeah, and they've got 10 of. They're already building another army in Maryland that will come back later under General Victor. You will hear that name at a future date.
Yep.
So that is the Union. The Union mobilization system goes burr. They're printing troops at a rate that Roth simply can't compete with.
Yeah.
So Roth is pretty much tied into I'm in Maryland. I can say that I'm in Maryland, which is technically Union territory, and I'm going to see if I can make the Union mad enough that they'll come attack me. Because he does know that it's not reasonable for him to do anything else.
Yeah, and we were expecting there to be a major battle there, and since I live probably about 20 minutes from that area in real life, I was staff riding, driving around like, okay, what does the terrain here look like? I was commissioning one of the umpires to make a map since none existed that was period appropriate of the Poolsville area. We were expecting this was going to be the showdown, but then nothing happened.
Yeah, we were expecting our 1861 Antietam, and effectively Eggert gets there, and unlike McClellan, Eggert just goes, "Nah, I'm good."
Yeah.
All right, I think that's good for us when we get to the next save.
Yeah, and we'll kind of cover east and west simultaneously here since we're all caught up. So that was June 30th, was that? Or yeah, I think so. Not too far. There we go. So, that was June 23rd, I think. So here's.
Yeah, that wasn't the 30th.
So here's June 30th, a week later, and we'll just see that the retreat in the west keeps going. It's what's going to be happening in the east that's of interest to us.
Yeah, and to note, during the retreat in the
west. Oh wait,
is
no, it was the 30th.
Oh.
So let's go to July.
Well, while you're loading the next one, to note, it was the lead up to the Battle of Shutting Gap that spurred one of our media players to take on an umpire role and literally build from scratch a very realistic logistics and staff officer system for the game. Yep. Because he was noting how impossible it was for both James and Archuleta to do the insane maneuvers they were doing, covering 30, 50, 60 miles a turn with basically no regard to supply lines. It looked like Erwin Rommel chasing Erwin Rommel around in Missouri. So he created from scratch a logistics system that is really the best I've ever seen as far as this. And I've been doing Kriegsspiel and Kriegsspiel adjacent games for 2 decades, and it's the best I've seen. So that Archuleta had some gripes because suddenly, actually, it was, if you go to Ironton at Ironton is when he discovers, holy crap, half my army, now that the logistics system has taken effect, half my army is combat ineffective.
Yeah.
And the enemy's still running, so I'm going to just let him. That's why James gets away after shutting Gap.
Yep.
And we don't continue to have this pursuit is because Archuleta suddenly feels the sting of, I have no supplies, and Ironton has a railroad, so I can reconstitute there. Or I can continue to pursue and watch my army disintegrate. At the same time, James is watching his army disintegrate. If you'll recall, the Battle of Shutting Gap was very low casualty and relatively short. Most of the losses that James has taken at this point are actually from just units falling apart. He's losing more. He's losing more men to exhaustion, desertion, and starvation and disease than he's lost in the battles. And that pain is going to continue until he ultimately reaches what is it? Yeah, until he reaches Osceola. That pain's going to continue. Of note, he is getting support heading to him, the Army of Alabama under James Miller.
Yep.
Which has the distinction of being both the shortest lived army in the game and also the army that covered the most physical territory.
It shifted between East and West. Yeah.
Yep. And it still is effectively the shortest lived army in the game.
Yep.
Overall. So that's pretty much, for the West, that's pretty much this turn. You'll note the Union has decided to start building what turns out to be a massive fort at Cairo, which is useful, not as useful as they would have hoped, just because, well, not as useful as they were thinking it was going to be, but about as useful as they would hope, because they ultimately are able to move away from Cairo as being the front lines.
Yeah.
Archuleta is reconstituting at Ironton. Harding is reconstituting at Cape Girardeau, and James and Boone are just trying to bug out at this point.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's going to be how the Western Theater is going to look pretty much for the next couple months.
Yep. And you'll note the Confederates are starting to build out the first of their fortifications as well.
Yeah.
Which that's one thing that I wish in hindsight we'd been able to kind of cover, because whereas in history, you're looking in remember, in early '63, you're all the way down at Vicksburg, which I'm looking for really quick on the map.
Sure.
Yeah, you're all the way down here by July of '63, and the Union basically has everything up here under their control.
Yep.
Our battle is confined to a space of approximately 130 miles of river is all that ever factors into this game.
Yeah.
It is a surprisingly, like James said, it's a surprisingly compact battlefield due to a neutral Kentucky that doesn't quite. The game ends before they really do their whole split and craziness, and just a terrain situation where the Confederates are able to capitalize on some good terrain around Memphis and create a circumstance that allows them to hold all the fighting in the West into Missouri and then this one little corner of Tennessee.
In Arkansas,
and that's,
yeah.
Yep. So moving on to the
east.
East.
Roth falls back across the river. Yeah.
Yep. To kind of note for people that have seen the naval stuff already, because I went way beyond this period in the Navy. This is that we are actually at the point where the Confederacy is purchasing the Giant Bag of Money fleet, and at this point, McCarroll is sitting right off of the Hampton Roads. The Confederates have fortified the Hampton Roads. They are fortifying literally everything. And the turn before this is when a British squadron kind of made its way up the coast, just not doing much, but just generally thumbing its nose at the U.S. Navy. And that is what occurs during this turn at sea. And then we'll get on to Roth.
Yeah.
Take it
Yeah.
away.
So Roth falls back across the river before, in a manner such that Eggert can't destroy part of his force during the crossing, which Eggert was kind of mad about. This is a trend: is that somebody does something and the other guy gets mad, and this happened on both sides a lot. But really, the reason why Roth retreated across the river here is so that he could hold up Eggert around Leesburg, freeing up a corps to go and put siege to Harper's Ferry.
Again.
See if he can take that out. Yeah, so the Union captured Harper's Ferry at the beginning of the game. That was the first move that the Union made, the first offensive move. And so Roth is attempting to rectify that at this point. And so he's stolen a march on the Union, and the Union are not going to be able to reach Harper's Ferry before it will fall to an assault from Confederate First Corps here, which, in addition to having 18 infantry and 12 artillery, is also being backed up by the entire artillery reserve of the Army of Northern Virginia, or the Army of the Potomac, actually, at this point. It's still the Confederate Army of the Potomac. So we have the Army of the Potomac fighting the Army of the Potomac. And so Harper's Ferry is going to fall quite rapidly. This was July 7th, so if I move to July 14th, we can see what's changed. Essentially, at this point, Eggert's mandate is to take the war back into Virginia. And of course, with him being on one side of the Potomac River and Roth being on the other side, that's going to be more complicated than you might imagine. And so in this turn, actually, yeah, I don't have... Oh man, I wish I had the interim states. Yeah, I've just got the... Yeah. So essentially what happened is this. Roth was here, as we saw. Eggert was here. And Roth sent all but one of his corps towards Harper's Ferry to try and concentrate there and attack. Eggert then attempted to cross the river in between Leesburg and Harper's Ferry, but was shadowed the whole time by Confederate cavalry in another one of the Confederate corps. And so he was unable to cross the river that way. And so he left 4th Corps, this corps, down here to watch Leesburg, tying down a little bit of the Confederate force, and then took the rest of his force up towards Harper's Ferry, towards the Maryland Heights. And then what happened is he sent his entire cavalry corps up through Sharpsburg to cross into Shepherdstown, while Roth was sitting in Harper's Ferry. And Roth, seeing the entire Union cavalry corps crossing at Shepherdstown, figured that that was where the Union Army was going to be concentrating. So he moved up that direction to go and attack the cavalry corps at Shepherdstown. The cavalry corps then retreated across the river again, defending the Shepherdstown Ford. I think they call it, what do they call it there? Boteler's Ford, I think it is. And prevented Roth from going into Maryland at Shepherdstown. And taking advantage of the distraction, Eggert then quickly marched to Berlin, Maryland, crossed the river, and then advanced into Harper's Ferry from the Virginia side, and capturing Harper's Ferry while Roth's entire army was up near Shepherdstown. And so it's also at this point that Roth, seeing what he thought was the Union Army concentrating at Shepherdstown, moved his forces away from Leesburg, opening up the opportunity for 4th Corps then to cross the river at Leesburg and then come in from the south to support Eggert. And so Egbert essentially bluffed his way across the Potomac in what probably was one of the most brilliant operational moves of the game, I'd say.
Definitely. Definitely,
So
because this was a almost bloodless evolution.
yeah,
And he
like
gets
very very little fighting.
yeah, Roth came back into Virginia because Roth wanted to for the most part, but at this point Roth is dancing to Eggert's tune because Eggert wants him to.
Yeah. And note now that the supply system is in order, Roth is now almost being cut off from his line of supply by Fourth Corps, and so he's now looking to retreat further into the Shenandoah Valley to secure his line of supply. And so Egbert actually is almost now able to undertake an offensive move, but Roth, being the aggressive type of commander he is actually going to see Fourth Corps cut off and the rest of the Union Army here without its cavalry support, and is going to move to try and get in between these Union concentrations and attack. And there's going to be a battle here at Charlestown coming up here in a second. Let's see if I can find it here.
Well, before you load that, if you'll pan over to the west, we'll quickly cover this.
Yeah.
So, if you panned over in the west, you have, if you remember, we had Harding at Cape Girardeau and we had Archuleta at Ironton, both reconstituting after their madhouse pursuits. In the intervening weeks, Harding has now moved back to Ohio City, which is a better spot for him anyway, and set up shop there. And Archuleta is now beginning a more methodical pursuit, using this cavalry to scout around and make sure he's not going to be cut off. And he is making his way down towards Osceola on the route that he pretty much knows James had to take. And James, Boone, and Sam Miller's Army of Alabama are all at Osceola. I will note this is about the last time Miller's in the West. I think it's the moves here that calls Miller to be called to the East. If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yep.
There was a lot of worry that the East was about to start collapsing.
Yep.
Especially since while Egbert, oh, that's right. Fourth Corps actually crossed the river here. It was the Army of Maryland that forced the Leesburg crossing, and then advanced on Arlington, seized the Arlington Heights, and forced the little detachment off of the Arlington Heights and back to Manassas. And so in 1 week, the Union went from Confederates of Maryland to having retaken Harper's Ferry and the Arlington Heights. And now Roth is on the back foot, retreating into the valley.
Yep. Yeah, and this detachment is, as you'll note, 4 infantry and 2 field artillery.
Previously, 6 infantry.
There was becoming quite a bit of fear that this new Army of Maryland, because if you look at what is sitting in D.C., if you combine those, there's starting to become some fear that they could make a play for Fredericksburg or Culpeper, or even start trying to make a play towards Richmond.
Yeah.
While Roth is now pinned up in the top of the valley.
Yeah, Roth is caught at this point really far out of position.
Yep. Yeah, this is one of the, week by week, this is, for the Eastern Theater, this is one of the worst positions Roth ever finds himself in.
Yeah.
All right, let's hit the next save real quick. And
yeah, July 14th, I think. Or was this July 14th?
Let's do the one after July 14th, because if it's the battle's already happened, then we'll need to discuss the battle anyway.
Yep. Yeah, we'll discuss Charlestown, and then probably that's all we'll need today. Yeah, July 21st, and then I've got the Charlestown saves. So I think July 21st, this save state's going to be, so the save state is post-Battle of Charlestown, post-Roth's counterattack. And you can see that Roth has managed to extricate himself from the valley and reconstitute the concentration of his forces around Manassas Junction, putting himself between the Union and Richmond, with Eggert following behind and the Army of Northern Virginia, as it's been renamed, um, instead of the Army of Maryland, uh, taking up a position at Fairfax.
Yep.
So then the fighting is going to be around Manassas.
Yep. And as I know, Sam Miller's Army of Alabama is going to arrive shortly.
Yep.
It's not there yet, but it is. It is. It is currently clipping its way across the horribly inadequate Confederate railroad system.
Yeah, it's a 2 week. It's a 2 week job for the Confederate
Yep.
railroads to get it there.
Yep, because and that is a note. Had this a Union force on northern railroads could have done this same journey on exterior lines faster.
Yeah, like
Just because the
less than
railroads
a
were
week.
that much better. Yeah, it'd have been about a week because they'd have had to go all the way up through Illinois,
Ohio
Indiana,
and
Ohio, and all that.
Yeah.
But still, they would have done it in a week. It's taking Miller 2, and he's got interior lines.
Yeah.
That is a plague that the Confederates try to redress, but they never really succeed in doing much with the whole game.
Yeah.
Which is very historical. The Confederates never could get any progress in the railroad department.
Yeah. So we can leave the operations there because it's at this point that it's kind of a new chapter. But let's talk about the Battle of Charlestown, where there's a nice big casino and horse racing track nowadays that people from Washington, D.C. like to go escape to because gambling used to be illegal there. Things being a Maryland resident. Right, yeah, true. They gamble with their own money instead of the country's money. Yeah, so let's go ahead and take a look at Charlestown. This one is nice because I actually took a lot of different saves during the battle. And so we can kind of watch the evolutions of the troops um, as they're moving around, unlike a lot of the other battles from this campaign so far. So this is kind of, this state here shows generally where they're coming onto the map from. I took a map of the battlefield of Winchester and kind of flipped it around and pretended like north was this way. Yeah, it's.
Yep. We did an Ultimate General Civil War.
Yeah, we did an Ultimate General. But yeah, so the Confederates are coming in from what should be the west, actually. And the Union is coming in from what should be the east. So my compass here is wrong. It's flipped 180. But yeah, so the Confederates are going to attempt to knock out this portion of the Union Army before this portion can make it to the fight. But that's not exactly how it's going to turn out. If I Here we go. All right, so here is 11:30. So this is probably a few turns in. Charlestown is actually, I think, the first battle where Lord Hughes, the Confederate president, actually took an active role in the fighting. We started kind of loosening the restrictions on presidents taking part in battles, I think, here, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so Union forces.
Yeah, this is the battle.
Yeah, Union forces. Part of them are forming up along this river here, in a very strong defensive position, whereas the other part is advancing forward to the other side, up to these woods here, which they thought would be a good defensive position as well. Kind of splitting themselves in half here and opening up the opportunity for Roth to defeat this corps in detail. And as you can see, the Confederates advancing up these two roads and deploying for battle, getting ready to assault these Union positions here. Just some cavalry skirmishing initially, kind of both sides figuring out where things are going to happen. Overall, not too much to report. You can see this half of the Union Army moving up the roads to the support of the southern wing of that Union force. The Confederates still have a lot of troops off map, moving into position. So if I can find it, here we go. Yep. So here's 12:30, an hour later. What has changed in an hour? Let's find out. Yeah. So that southern half of the Union Army has extended the lines to the south, and so the Union defensive line is very strong along most of this battlefield. The Northern Union Corps is extending its line south in front of the defensive line, and so we've essentially got at the moment one Union Corps fighting the entire Confederate Army, which is it's not going to go well. Let's say that this is going to end up being a Union retrograde back across and behind their defensive line. I think to be fair to the Union, what they're trying to do is fight a delaying action here to provide time for Eggert's main line here along the river to build breastworks. But
Yep.
I'm not in Eggert's head, so.
Yeah, they were, and I think in the next Saber 2 you're going to start seeing them pop up. The Union plan here was to dig in and contain. I will note two things that kind of come out of these battles, especially in the East, but really both. But the East was more prevalent with it. Was hey, let's build field fortifications in the middle of a battle, which as umpires we allowed, kind of hearkening to something that Marshall brought up about players gaming the system. There was a bit of that with making the decision to throw up field works. A lot of these battles turned into World War I with muskets, instead of what they would have been historically. But that is what it is, and that's people with modern sensibilities who go with I want to put as much dirt and wood between me and bullets as possible versus I want to stand in straight lines and fight it out.
Or
Another
rather,
thing,
the impulse being like, I'm above this. I don't want to dig trenches. That sucks, right?
yeah,
That
yeah.
was. It took a lot of convincing to get these soldiers to dig trenches back in the day.
Yep.
Until they realized their benefit.
Another thing you'll note is, and you will see a lot of this early on in '61. You will not see this much in the East after the next month or so. Is cavalry being thrown into the line? You'll see a lot of cavalry that have taken casualties. That becomes a relatively common thing early on. Both sides were hurling their cavalry into fights. They were using, as you can see right here, Roth is using his cavalry divisions as a flanking force on the infantry, throwing them into the line as essentially, rapidly moving dismounted infantry. And ultimately, both sides beat their cavalry arm to death in the next really the next 2 months of this campaign. They beat their cavalry arms to death in the East. And that seriously hampers the West because the West is always deprived of cavalry because the East is killing it as hard as they can.
Mm-hmm. And the East, then, they realize the cavalry is the least replaceable wing of their army and the most useful in the operational sense. And so, basically, from after a couple months later from this battle onwards, the cavalry then the 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 poor players that end up with a cavalry division command in a battle are given their orders, and their orders are go and observe place X. Do not pass go. Do not collect your cavalry charge. You will not sacrifice any of your troopers for anything because
Yeah, we'll get to it, but I think we see after within like by September of '61, the cavalry getting engaged, stuck in the east is pretty much dead unless they're needed as the last reserve. And I think we'll see one more series of cavalry charges in the west, and that's it.
yeah, yeah, we'll see
The
that
cavalry,
series of
yeah,
cavalry charges at Troy, but I think that's pretty much it.
yep, yep. The cavalry arm kind of waxes and wanes. In I would say in May of '61, the May to September of '61, the one part of the army on either side you didn't want to be a part of was the cavalry.
Yeah, they
And
were
then
fought to
after
death.
yep, after that, I would probably say the artillery is the one part of the army you didn't want to be a part of.
Mm. Yep.
So if you could start the war off as an artillerist who then found a horse and became a cavalry trooper, you might survive this thing.
And if you're in the infantry, you were screwed either way because you were just getting
Pretty
shot at
much.
every time. So yeah, we can see. Let's go ahead and go to. This was 12:30, so let's hit 13:30 and see what's
Yep.
changed.
So, and to note within the system, without getting too deep into the nuts and bolts, for reasons within the system, there are basically two types of event that will cause significant disruption to a unit. Those are double timing for extended periods. Well, three types: double timing, charging, engaging in close combat, or digging trenches. Those are kind of your three things that will disrupt troops. So every time you see people throwing up these breastworks, they're also paying a price in units getting disrupted from throwing up breastworks. So it's a case of do you gain some? Do you gain a +1 or maybe a +2 and a little bit of a kind of almost a morale bonus for your human player because now they have something that they can see on a map that is their physical trenches and you develop ownership of that and you want to hold it. Yes, but by the same token, you're also weakening your force to do it. So it's a catch-22. And to some degree, once you start digging trenches, you are stuck there because by the time you get done throwing up the breastworks, your guys are too tired to march out of them.
Yeah. Not immediately thereafter, anyway. Yeah.
Yep. All right, so let's get to the nasty.
Yeah. So we can see that I guess it would have been Union First Corps. Yeah, is making its retrograde evolution back across the river or the creek. I guess you could really call it. Kind of more like a marshy, 1 to 2 foot deep creek. Um, and so being constantly pressured by the Confederates all the while. And you can see just this massive amount of artillery the Confederates have that they just cannot bring to bear. They're going to find a way to bring it to bear, but it's just at this point in the war, these massive artillery parks, because both sides were like, we need artillery, and then immediately decided to throw all of it at the front line and just totally just sink their logistics chains with, oh, we
Yep.
need more artillery ammo. But yeah, so we can see just these massive amounts of artillery, almost as many batteries as there are regiments, moving around
Yep.
here.
And this is where, on the Union side, if you'll note, every one of these regiments that's in the line is Pennsylvania. This is the Pennsylvania Reserve. And
Yep.
and this is the moment that they are thrown into the line. They are green as grass. And they are hurled into the line because everything, if you'll look behind them, everything else is either beat to crap or is broken and running for their lives. The
Yep.
Confederate cavalry has made it across and is literally chewing its way through their artillery.
Yep.
These guys saved the Union Artillery Park. It was Sophos was commanding that. He saved the Union Artillery Park because at just prior to this save, the I remember who was commanding this. Roth himself was commanding this. That's right, and he had Hugs, and I think Hugs was directly commanding this portion. They did bag 2 Union batteries, and they came very close to bagging. I think they would have probably bagged everything up to about this one.
Yeah.
If the Pennsylvania reserves hadn't they bum rushed in and basically, to use the boxing analogy, they threw a jab right as they were getting pinned up against the ropes and bought just enough time to slip out.
I think that it was this brigade here, Second Brigade of the First Division, First Corps. I think Eggert gave it the name the Excelsior Brigade, which was a name, or was it the Excelsior Brigade? I think it was. Yeah. So he gave them a special name, and like in his order of battle, he like highlighted them. It was like they're special, and he like created a bunch of lore around them because of this action. So that was fun. That was fun to all read about. So let's go ahead and move on to 1430.
Yeah, the big thing to note here is that while the Union has this strong line with this creek backing it, if you look at where the Confederate weight is, it's nowhere near that line.
Yep, they could totally go around it if they want to.
Yep.
So the Union managed to reform their line in the north in time enough to prevent the Confederates from doing that very effectively.
And I will say just barely.
Just barely, yeah.
Because another thing to note, you'll see like this regiment has 3 hits.
30% casualties, yeah.
Yep, the 5th hit, a unit takes their 5th hit in the system and it dissolves because 50% casualties in the time frame of these battles of just 2 to 3 real life hours. If you went from a 600-man regiment to 300 guys left in 3 hours, you're done.
Yeah.
You're completely done. You're not sticking around any longer.
It doesn't cease to exist in the operational sense, but it does cease to exist in the tactical sense. So, yeah, we remove it from play at that point. Yeah.
Yep. And here's where the Confederates finally get their artillery park into play.
Yep.
And it is.
And same with the Union too. The Union sees the Confederates lining up all their batteries, and so they line up all of theirs, and it's just this huge exchange of artillery fire. At least 100 guns here firing at each other between the two sides. Yeah. Ugh. Heavy casualties in the artillery wing here.
There's almost 100. I'm counting them up. There's almost 150 guns in the Confederate artillery park, and about 100 of them are firing at this point.
Yeah.
They've got about 50 more that they don't have space for. They had more guns than they had space.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, some of these guns are heavy guns that the Confederates are trying to get into their batteries.
And to put this in perspective, this is more artillery that the Confederates are firing off right now than they had in the barrage against the Union center at Gettysburg before Pickett's charge. This is more right now in 1861, which I think kind of exposed a flaw in the way we mobilize forces. But either way.
Well, this winds up biting them. This winds up starting to bite later, and would have bit really hard by 63 because this is a decision to go into the operational side, a decision that Hugs made himself as playing the Stevens, president of the Confederacy in this game, was that he was going to recast most of the Union guns that he seized at Gosport. So they took out every gun at Gosport that was suitable to be used in the Army. They took some of the heavy guns, and then the rest of them, they basically all the old brass cannons and whatnot from there they sent up to Tredegar and what other works they had, and this is the point where that big kind of groundswell of artillery reached the front lines. So this is about as powerful as a Confederate artillery arm ever gets. It's never going to be this good again.
True. Yeah. All right, so there's 1430. And we can see in the South the Union is starting to get a little bit adventurous. They're like, the Confederates aren't here. I wonder if we can take advantage of that. So we'll see what happens with that. So that was 1430. Let's move now to, was that 1330? No, that was 1430. Yeah. So then let's go to 1515 near the end of the battle here. I think this is pretty much the end of the battle, if I'm not mistaken. And pretty much what's going to happen is the Confederates realize that they aren't going to be able to. Oh no, right. The Confederates break the northern part of the Union line, and so you can see here this breaks. But the Confederates have also taken severe casualties, and so they're going to have to, spend some time to reorganize and get fresh units forward, and that's going to give the Union time to extricate themselves back towards Harper's Ferry. Actually, probably with the way that they're retreating north towards Shepherdstown.
Yep.
And
the
Confederates then, because Fourth Corps isn't here, are going to withdraw, start heading south, and try to knock out Fourth Corps, which they don't end up doing. Fourth Corps gets away, and then
And as you can see over here in our, was this the South?
Yeah.
Okay. In the southern part of the battlefield, the Union really tried hard, and again, they threw their cavalry headlong into massed musketry, trying to get that flank turned and break this. And ultimately, they were stopped pretty cold. The Confederates in the center took quite a number of casualties just under bombardment.
Yeah.
But as you can note here, they had finally gotten enough guns in the line that they were starting to wear down and break the Union artillery out as well.
Yeah.
So the Union in the north, their attack really petered out before it began. They never quite got it moving, and the Confederates had massed and were able to simply turn. And something to keep in mind, me and Carter are both, and most of our umpires as well, are relatively brutal umpires on screenshots. So we don't show, if you're seeing a unit, we're not going to show you everything stacked behind it unless you can also see that. You'll just see the front. So the Union forces came into this not realizing the Confederates had another brigade stacked back here, and they were able to just shift and stymie that, and then launch their massed assault by First Corps. And this is where First Corps started to get its reputation cemented as being the immortals, because these guys,
Confederate First Corps,
the Confederate First Corps. From the Battle of Manassas on, it developed a reputation that it did not leave the field until it saw the backs of the enemy.
Yep.
The First Corps, I think they retreated once in this entire campaign. There's many times they withdrew, but I think there's only one time they were truly forced to retreat rather than withdraw on their own terms. And this battle is no exception. First Corps takes a licking, but pounds it on through and shatters ultimately all of this and just breaks it. Enough of this breaks that I think enough of this was breaking that we just started to institute cascading breaks across this entire force, especially after this charge.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, and so that's pretty much the Battle of Charlestown. So even though Roth got outmaneuvered operationally, he managed to beat the Union tactically, but not in a way that made much of an operational difference. and so he ended up having to retreat out of the valley anyway, and managed to make his way down to Manassas. This this probably the operational impact of this battle was giving Eggert enough of a bloody nose to prevent Eggert then from aggressively trying, in the operational sense, to trap Roth or do something to, uh, force Roth into a disadvantageous battle. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. This is one where Eggert came into this with one idea of how it was going to go, and Roth had a different one, and Roth's worked out. There's these two are going to be back and forth the entire campaign.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's going to be the meeting of the minds here, and the history behind it is that Roth and Eggert, the two real life players behind them, have been wargaming with each other for quite some time now, and so they kind of already are in each other's head as far as they know how each of them ticks, and so they're
Yep.
trying. Each of them is trying to outsmart the other by using their personal knowledge of each other to their advantage. And so neither one of them is going to gain a decisive advantage. And so what's going to end up happening is that one will outsmart the other temporarily, and then the other will outsmart, and then it'll go back and forth. So it's really a pretty interesting melee in Virginia between the two of them.
Yeah, and they even created canon between the two of them that they are actual cousins.
Yep.
Or like Roth is Eggert's uncle or something along those lines, and they had this whole really good, rich storyline developed between the two. But this is honestly this is the first time that Roth and Eggert meet when it's not a horrific disadvantage for Eggert.
Yep.
And Roth kind of continues his mystique of being relatively invincible. Um, Obviously, the media plays it up. I will note that operationally, Eggert's not that perturbed because they did inflict relatively even casualties on each other. That's something else in this game is that I don't think people realized how even the casualties were.
True.
There are a grand total of 3 engagements in this whole game where the casualties are more than 10% different.
Yeah. And one of
There,
them was First Manassas, which was
yep,
ridiculous.
yep, and the other two we will get to, which are also ridiculous.
Yeah.
But you're not seeing the decisive battle. If you had the land version of the Kantai Kessen going, yeah, you're failing. You're not seeing the decisive battle ever.
Yep.
Every battle is decisive, and it just leads you to the next battle.
Yep.
But to note, this is one of those. Eggert is still on thin ice, and this battle does not help him. Actually, I think post this battle, if I'm not mistaken, I think the president wanted to fire him for failing to corner and destroy Roth, and the Secretary of War saved him and
Yeah.
said, "No, you're not firing this guy because he fights and he kept his army together. Nope, we didn't win, but Roth is bloodied and unable to do anything, and we've achieved our strategic objective for the moment."
Yeah.
But there was an incredible amount of I won't say a shouting match, but there was an incredible amount of back and forth between at the higher echelons about commanders and why they weren't seeing results. Which, again, just like history, there was the Union side especially did a lot of shouting back and forth about why aren't we seeing results. They were very quick to criticize a general for failing to achieve an objective sent down from DC, and very quick to fire one on it. The Confederacy was more forgiving to some degree. Davis interfered a lot, but they were generally more forgiving of their more popular commanders, and sometimes more forgiving of commanders they should have got rid of a long time ago. Brag. But the yeah to while we're finishing up, to note my gripe that Fort Bragg in North Carolina should never have been changed to Fort Liberty, because Fort Bragg is an MVP for the Union.
Mr. Bragg was the best Union general in the West.
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, just kind of one last thing before we go here. I think the fact that in this game we really didn't have a decisive battle besides Manassas, and like in the European, like Napoleonic sense of like decisive battle, it kind of, I've been reading Paddy Griffith's book on the battle tactics of the Civil War, and part of his thesis is that like the reason that the Civil War lasted so long, the reason that is part of why the Civil War is the way it is because neither side could like achieve a decisive battle, and so I think it speaks to the credit of our rules that, and this isn't like the players being stupid. It wasn't the generals in the Civil War being stupid. It's the reality of Civil War combat makes a decisive battle close to impossible to achieve. And so,
Yep.
Um,
yeah. To not to trash Paddy Griffith, because he is a very good historian, but to note, because I've read that same book as well, to note the biggest problem they had was you were trying to use 1812. They started out trying to use 1812 tactics with rifles that could not only reach out effectively twice as far, they could also effectively target. You weren't, while a lot of guys were just blasting away at the other formation, you were blasting away at the other formation with a weapon that at 200 yards could effectively target another human being.
true.
And so you were seeing a lot higher casualty rate in these gunfights, and these gunfights would devolve. And we see that in our rules. We see that a little bit in any Kriegsspiel, but we see that in this rule set, and it was seen in the Civil War. You didn't have the march up to till you see the whites of their eyes, fire one, maybe two volleys, and charge, and it's over. You had units engaging in desultory, middling range volley fire for half an hour, just shooting their entire cartridge boxes dry, ripping into each other, and casualties just mounting the whole time. And by the time you get around to an assault, it's over. Plus, when you have this level of artillery and you have this level of musketry, you could put Napoleon himself on this field, and he would form an assault column, and it would be absolutely destroyed in 5 minutes. If Napoleon's guys really hated running uphill against the British, because they would take the as seen by the Sharp series, the thin red line just tearing into the column until they finally bog it down, you're looking at guys able to fire at that same rate twice as far with more accuracy. They would. You can't do it. You just only in certain terrain circumstances will there be an opportunity to do an echelon column assault like you were seeing in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the next big European wars, if you go to the Austro-Prussian War and then the Franco-Prussian War, your big assault columns, which are huge assault columns of divisions, get absolutely annihilated by massed rifle fire.
Yeah.
So that is kind of to explain why you see so much of this and so much of this back and forth. It really becomes a reserves game.
Yep. Whoever's army can stay in the field longer wins.
Yep. And just to keep everybody in line, we are still not caught up to the Navy. We will have another episode that will hopefully catch us up to the Navy, which is sitting on the cusp of the Delaware invasion, which I know everybody is scratching their heads and going, "What the hell is he talking about?"
Right, because that would have never happened in the real Civil War, but in our Civil War, shit happens. Um,
because what is more insane than a riverine assault by troops that have never engaged in riverine warfare? An amphibious invasion by an army that has never seen the concept of an amphibious invasion in its entire existence.
Yep.
By officers who have never witnessed nor participated in the first amphibious invasion or amphibious exercise, because guess what? In North America in the 1860s, nobody had done an amphibious invasion.
Yep.
The last amphibious invasion was New Orleans, and that was done by the British.
British were pretty good at that. So didn't work out that time for them.
But that's just a note that while it's possible that somebody living had witnessed an amphibious assault, nobody had done one.
Yep.
Or even planned one, because it was wholly unnecessary. The U.S. Army at West Point at this time was focusing on engineering because they were one of the premier engineering schools, and teaching you how to fight Indians on the frontier in the West, because those were the two things that you needed to know how to do: build crap and fight Indians, and kind of sort of understand how to maybe command a brigade of troops, because you might do that once or twice.
Yep. Once or twice, because there
And
were like
yep,
12 regiments in the entire army. So brigade,
yep,
holy crap, that's like half the army.
yep. So you were looking at 20 years of crap and probably getting out, and if you stuck it out, you might get command of a brigade before you retired. And suddenly these guys are in command of armies 6 and 7 times the size of what they ever thought they would see in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And like we noted, then somebody decided, well, we have boat, we have army, let's put army on boat.
Yeah, so
And
sorry.
that'll be next episode. I think we leave you with that.
Next episode. Yeah, that could be next episode because
Yeah,
that
because
kind of happens
there's only one or two more battles of the Capes, and those are very short.
Yeah, yeah. So that'll be next episode, and then we can talk about how that impacted the operations in Virginia in the episode afterward. So, yeah. Well, thank you guys for putting up with our hour and a half rant, or however long that was. I think it was an hour and a half. 2 hours! Holy cow! All right. Anyways, so I'll finish up. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. I hope that this kind of Joe Rogan podcast format, as opposed to a Little Wars TV, highly polished, highly edited product, is at least somewhat entertaining for the TikTok generation. Anyways, so let us know if you have any questions in the comments. I'll try and answer them. And we'll see you in the next episode. See you guys.
So yeah.